Hey everybody. In this video, I want to give you some social and historical context and also some literary context for a lot of the fiction written by women in the 19th century. So first of all, some social and historical context. This information is meant to help us understand a little bit more about the characters that we're meeting in this literature and what the expectations readers had for these characters and what they did. So I want to talk about this idea called the cult of true womanhood, sometimes called the cult of domesticity. This was not a phrase that existed at the time. A historian in the late 1900s named Barbara Welter came up with this term to describe the different expectations for women at the time. Mostly this applied to white middle-class women, but you'll see how these kinds of expectations transcended race and class too. So first of all, piety. Women were considered more innately pure than men, closer to God, less inclined to sinfulness, partly because they weren't exposed to the evils of the outside world. So women were expected to be faithful, and we're talking mainly about the Christian faith of the dominant culture at the time. Women were also supposed to be submissive, first to their fathers and then to their husbands. They were never to disagree with their husbands. They were never to argue with their husbands. Husbands, at first fathers and then husbands, had final word on everything. This is one of the reasons it didn't make sense for men and many women for women to get the right to vote, because they would just do what their husband said anyway. Domesticity. Women were supposed to stay in the home and concern themselves with matters of the home and child rearing. You may have heard of the ideology of the separate spheres, public and private. The public sphere was for men. The world of business and commerce and politics and all that other stuff was for men. The private sphere, the home, was the world for women, and it was women's responsibility to uphold a good domestic setting, a good home for their husbands to return to at the end of their day in the public sphere. And then finally, purity. Women were supposed to be sexually pure until marriage, and even after marriage, they certainly weren't supposed to be interested in any kind of physical or sexual desire. Again, that's all the work of historian Barbara Welter. So you can see how a lot of people at the time really bought into these ideas, and we still do to some extent, of how women are supposed to behave in the world. And by contrast, what this implies about the opposites for men. It's kind of confining for everybody here. So let's now look at some literary context. You may have heard of the hero's journey, or the monomyth, that a scholar named Joseph Campbell noticed when he started studying mythologies and stories from Western culture, from cultures around the world, actually. A lot of the stories that we tell have a similar plot pattern, and he identified the stages of these plot patterns, and they're quite intricate, but I'm just going to talk about 4 stages that he identified in these stories. Here's some examples of these stories, by the way, that adopt this plot pattern to some degree, right? Harry Potter, Star Wars, the Odyssey. Think about Huck Finn. So the basics of this plot pattern. First, we start with an orphaned boy or a young man. And then this boy is called to adventure, some sort of quest is expected of him. He must embark on this journey, and in doing so, he's thrust into a whole new world, new places, new people. To achieve his quest, though, he first has to undergo these battles, and they're physical battles, right? Think about Harry Potter and his magic wand battles with Voldemort. They are physical battles, battles of skill and strength, but also they are battles of his character, courage. If he succeeds in these battles, then he is rewarded. He gets to go home to his family or his community, and the reward is his to claim. Now, let's talk about, keeping all of that in mind, let's talk about the domestic or sentimental fiction of the mid-1800s. Both of these terms have been used to describe a lot of the novels that were written before the Civil War and after. So, in an earlier video, I talked about how during this time, the economic and social conditions were kind of ripe for the novel to thrive. There's a greater literate audience, there's more publishing opportunities, and middle-class women, middle-class white women in particular, had lots of time to read. So some of the fiction that was most popular at the time, actually almost all the fiction that was most popular in the mid 1800s was written by women for women, called domestic fiction or sometimes sentimental fiction. Uh, these were best-selling novels. A lot of them haven't survived, right? Remember the canon and ideas of literary excellence. At the time, it wasn't considered serious fiction, so a lot of it hasn't survived, but I want you to be aware of what was really, really popular at the time and how it works with the cult of domesticity that we just talked about. A scholar named Nina Baim at the U of I read a lot of these novels and identified, just like Campbell identified a plot pattern, she identified a similar plot pattern, actually, that she called the plot of seduction or the marriage plot, depending upon what happened. So let's take a look. The setting is always domestic. Somebody's home, maybe a boarding school, and it features an orphaned girl. Typically, she's a teenager about to be of marrying age. So the battles, her battles, she's not going out getting in these physical fights, right? She's not really going anywhere. But her battles are in the form of seduction. Some really handsome, rich man comes along and she is interested, but it soon becomes clear that his motives are unsavory and he wants to seduce her. This is her battle. Does she allow herself to be seduced? Well, if she does, as you remember, she's expected to be pure. She's not supposed to give in at all until after she's married. So what happens for these girls if they lose their battles and allow themselves to be seduced is that they're ostracized. They're punished. They get sick. They die alone. They're kicked out of their community. It's really desperate, depressing stuff. And remember, these novels served an instructional purpose. They told the young women who are reading them, don't mess around with these awful men. Be virtuous and be pure. Okay, so if she loses, things don't look good. If she wins, if she manages to hold off and resist the temptation of the handsome rich man, she is rewarded when another better man comes along and she gets to marry him and she gets to live her happy ever after. Because remember, marriage is the ultimate goal for young women at this time. They are raised to believe that their end goal is to get married and have kids. Okay, so this is the plot of seduction or the marriage plot, depending upon what the heroine decides to do. So I want you to think about that when we're reading the fiction that we're reading by women, also by men. Think about how this might apply to Mrs. Mallard in Story of an Hour. Remember, she gets the marriage. The story picks up after that, though, and we start to realize that marriage maybe wasn't all that she was led to believe it might be. So what we see happening in this time period then after the Civil War is an increasing number of women wanting to leave the domestic sphere, wanting to get involved in the public realm, wanting to express themselves on social issues, wanting to vote. So I want you to keep thinking about how female writers and also male writers at this time are creating characters who might defy the expectations, right? They start to adapt the marriage plot. They start to think, could there be other possibilities, other endings besides marriage? That's the context I want you to think about when you read A New England Nun, when you read A White Heron, when you read The Yellow Wallpaper, and next week when we read Daisy Miller by Henry James. Okay? So setting aside all of that stuff about domestic fiction, I want to kind of change the subject here and talk about regionalism, which is a branch of realism. For the last couple of weeks, we've talked about literary realism. We've talked about how it features ordinary characters doing ordinary things in ordinary places, often wrestling with complex ethical choices, right? And often these stories have a lesson to teach us. All of this applies to regionalism, but like the name implies, there's a special emphasis on place, on a specific geographical location in the United States, and the people, the mannerisms, the dialect, the habits and customs of the people who occupy it. Here's a quotation I like from scholars Federley and Price. Regional writers respect and cherish the actual places that provide the environmental context for these characters. So, in other words, the characters have a positive relationship with the places that they're in. And Federley and Price go on to say that these characters tend to develop within these places and they develop a relationship to the place that is central to what she learns about herself. I want you to think about that with the first two stories that we're reading for this week, Freeman and Jewett. They are both considered major realist writers. You may have never heard of them, but in the late 1800s, they were superstars. They were well-regarded writers. And with the canon, they kind of went out of style and have recently been reclaimed and rediscovered. But I also want to remind you that Mark Twain does all of these things too, right? Huck Finn and Jim, their story is very rooted in a specific part of the country, the Mississippi River. And they do have a positive relationship with this place. It's central to Huck's identity. So at best, the label regionalism gives us a way to understand what these authors' interests are and what their subjects are. But at worst, it can be minimizing. It can be reductive. Mark Twain doesn't really get considered a regionalist writer. He gets to be considered a realist writer because his themes are considered universal. So I just want you to think about the ways that these labels can be useful, but can also sometimes be reductive and used particularly to pigeonhole what the establishment might think of as a minor writer. Something to be aware of. So coming up, the last story that we're reading this week, The Yellow Wallpaper, is considered to be an example of psychological realism. I talk about that in the reading guide. Use the reading guide, and we'll talk more about psychological realism going into next week. As always, let me know if you have any questions at all. I really hope that you enjoy the stories this week and think about how some of this context might help us understand better what these characters are doing.